The October rain had been falling steadily for 3 days now. That particular Seattle drizzle that doesn't announce itself with thunder or drama but simply settles into the bones of the city like an old familiar ache. And as I stood in Robert's home office that Wednesday afternoon, watching the water streak down the window in endless rivulets that caught the gray light and fractured it into 1,000 tiny prisms, I had no idea that I was about to discover something that would fracture my entire life in much the same way. The room smelled of Robert's cologne, that woody, expensive scent he'd worn for as long as I could remember, mixed with the mustiness of old books and the faint electrical smell of his various devices charging on the credenza, and everything about the space spoke of order, of a man who kept his life in neat compartments, labeled and filed and perfectly controlled. Robert had called me that morning from Portland, where he was supposedly consulting for a tech startup that needed his financial expertise for their upcoming merger. His voice crackling slightly over the phone line as he asked if I could please, darling, find the 2023 tax documents in his office and email them to our accountant, Harold, who apparently needed them for some amendment or another that I hadn't quite followed because I'd been in the middle of making lunch and only half listening in. That way that 38 years of marriage sometimes allows. I'd said yes, of course, barely thinking about it, because this was the kind of small favor that made up the fabric of our daily life together. These little interdependencies and requests that bound us together in a web of domestic partnership that I'd always found comforting rather than constraining. But now, standing here in front of his immaculately organized desk with its matching leather accessories and its carefully arranged stack of financial magazines and its framed photograph of the three of us, Robert, Daniel and me, taken at Daniel's college graduation nearly 13 years ago, I couldn't find the damn tax documents anywhere in their usual spot in the second drawer down on the right side, where Robert kept all our important papers in color-coded folders that he'd labeled with his neat architectural handwriting. I'd gone through every folder twice, pulling each one out and examining its contents with increasing frustration, wondering if perhaps he'd misfiled them or if they were in some other location entirely. And it was this small disruption to the expected order of things that led me to do something I normally never would have done, something that breached an unspoken trust that I hadn't even realized we'd established until the moment I violated it. His laptop sat on the desk, closed and sleeping, its silver surface reflecting the gray light from the window in a way that made it look almost liquid, and I found myself reaching for it before I'd consciously made the decision to do so, my fingers already lifting the screen before my mind had caught up with my actions. The screen bloomed to life with that characteristic Apple chime that always sounded too cheerful, and I was confronted with the login screen, that simple rectangular box asking for a password, and without hesitation, because why would I hesitate, this was my husband, we shared everything. I typed in the numbers that represented our anniversary date, the same password he'd been using for years because Robert, despite all his financial acumen and his understanding of security protocols, was ultimately a creature of sentiment when it came to things like this. The desktop appeared, clean and organized just like everything else in Robert's life, with folders neatly arranged along the right side and a background photo of the San Juan Islands from our trip last summer, and I navigated to his documents folder, searching for anything that might be labeled as tax-related, clicking through various subdirectories with the kind of determination that comes from being given a task and wanting to complete it efficiently. I was so focused on my search, on finding these documents so I could email them to Harold and get back to the novel I'd been reading in the living room, that I almost missed the notification that appeared in the upper right corner of the screen, a small rectangular pop-up that would have disappeared after a few seconds if I hadn't happened to glance up at exactly the right moment. The notification was from an email application, but not Robert's usual email, not the one that ended in our shared family domain name that we'd set up years ago when Daniel had convinced us we needed to get with the times regarding technology, and the address that flashed briefly before my eyes was something else entirely. archin.private@gmail.com, an address I'd never seen before, had never known existed, and the preview text that accompanied it made my breath catch in my throat in a way that I couldn't quite explain, my chest suddenly tight with something that might have been curiosity or might have been the first whisper of dread. "I can't keep doing this," the preview read, the words appearing in that gray notification box like an accusation, like a confession, like a door opening onto something I wasn't sure I wanted to see. "Daniel deserves to know the truth. We both know what happened that night wasn't an accident." My hand, which had been resting on the trackpad, seemed to freeze in place, my finger hovering over the notification as if touching it might make it real in a way that simply seeing it did not, and I could feel my heart beginning to beat faster, That peculiar acceleration that happens when your body knows something is wrong before your mind has quite processed the information. Daniel deserves to know the truth. Our son's name appearing in an email sent to my husband's secret account, linked to something that wasn't an accident, and the implications of those words seemed to multiply in my mind like cells dividing, each possibility spawning another, each more troubling than the last. I should have closed the laptop right then, should have stepped away from the desk and called Robert and asked him directly what this email address was, what this message meant, giving him the courtesy and respect that nearly 4 decades of marriage surely deserved. But instead I found myself clicking on the notification, my finger moving seemingly of its own accord, driven by something primal and urgent that overrode my usual sense of propriety and privacy. The email application opened, revealing not just the one message but an entire inbox, dozens upon dozens of emails exchanged between archin.private@gmail.com and an address that simply read sarah.lockwood1975@gmail.com, and the dates on these emails stretched back months, 8 months according to the oldest one I could see without scrolling, and each subject line seemed to pulse with hidden meaning, with secret conversations that had been happening parallel to my life without my knowledge. The most recent email, the one whose notification had started this avalanche, was dated yesterday, Tuesday, October 17th, sent at 10:47 p.m., which meant Robert had been in his hotel room in Portland when he'd received it, had probably been reading it while I was here at home getting ready for bed, brushing my teeth and setting out my clothes for the next day, and thinking about absolutely nothing more consequential than whether I needed to buy more coffee at the grocery store. I clicked on the email with fingers that had begun to tremble slightly, and the full message expanded on the screen, filling my vision with words that seemed both crystal clear and utterly incomprehensible at the same time. Robert, it began with a familiarity that made my stomach clench, I know you think we have more time, but the doctors told me today that the cancer has spread faster than they expected, and I have maybe 6 months if I'm lucky, and I can't leave this world without him knowing, without Daniel knowing who I am and why I made the choices I made. And I know we agreed to wait until he was older, until the time was right, but when is the time ever right for something like this? The email continued in this vein, this intimate, pleading tone that spoke of a relationship between the writer and my husband that went far beyond anything I could have imagined, and words jumped out at me from the screen like physical blows. Our son, she'd written, and the promise you made me, and James can't hide behind his political career forever, and the night of the accident that changed everything. And with each phrase I felt something inside me cracking, the foundation of my understanding of my life developing fissures that spread and deepened with every word I read. I scrolled up, my hands now shaking so badly that I had to steady my right hand with my left, navigating backward through the email chain, watching the conversation unspool in reverse, and what I found there was somehow both exactly what I'd feared and nothing at all like what I'd expected. This wasn't about an affair, at least not in the conventional sense. There were no declarations of love, no plans to meet in hotel rooms, no romantic reminiscences about stolen moments, but instead there was something far more complex and far more devastating, a web of connection that stretched back not months but decades, back to before Robert and I had even met, back to a time in his life that he'd always characterized as lonely and directionless, the years before he'd found me and we'd built our life together. Sarah, this woman whose name I'd never heard spoken in my home, whose existence I'd had no idea about until 5 minutes ago, was apparently someone Robert had known when he was young, someone he'd been involved with in a way that had produced consequences that had shaped the entire trajectory of our lives. And as I read through email after email, piecing together the story they told through references to the past and discussions of the present and anxieties about the future, I began to understand something that made the room seem to tilt around me, the furniture and walls suddenly feeling unstable and untrustworthy. Daniel, our son, the child we'd adopted when he was 3 days old through a private adoption that Robert had arranged through a lawyer friend, the baby I'd held in the hospital nursery and fallen in love with instantly and completely, the boy I'd raised and nurtured and loved with every fiber of my being for 34 years, was not just some random child who'd needed a home and whom we'd been lucky enough to adopt. The emails made it clear, through careful references and coded language that was obviously meant to maintain some kind of plausible deniability, but which became transparent once you understood the context, that Daniel was Robert's biological son, the child of his relationship with Sarah, and that the adoption had not been the straightforward private arrangement I'd always believed it to be but rather something far more complicated, involving Sarah's wealthy family and their desire to keep the pregnancy secret and threats, and some kind of accident that had occurred the night Daniel was born, and a cover-up that apparently involves someone named James who was now, according to these emails, a United States senator whose career would be destroyed if the truth came out. I don't know how long I sat there reading through those emails, my body utterly still except for my finger on the trackpad, scrolling and clicking and piecing together this hidden history that had been running underneath my life like an underground river, shaping the landscape from below in ways I'd never suspected. But eventually I became aware that the light outside had shifted, that the afternoon was bleeding into evening, and that my neck was stiff and my eyes were burning and my throat was dry because I'd been breathing through my mouth, shallow panicked breaths that weren't quite sobs but weren't quite normal respirations either. The rain had intensified, drumming now against the window with more insistence, and somewhere in the house I could hear the furnace kick on, that familiar rumble and whoosh that usually comforted me but which now seemed ominous, as if the house itself was breathing, alive and aware of the violation of trust happening within its walls. Robert had lied to me, not just recently, not just about these emails and this secret correspondence, but for our entire marriage from the very beginning, allowing me to believe that we were adopting a child together as equal partners when in fact he'd been adopting his own biological son, reuniting with his own flesh and blood while letting me think I was experiencing the same thing he was experiencing, letting me believe that we were both Daniel's parents in exactly the same way when in fact, his connection to our son ran through blood and biology in a way mine never could. And he'd been in contact with Sarah all these years, sending her photos according to one email I'd found from 3 years ago, updating her on Daniel's life, maintaining this secret parallel relationship with Daniel's birth mother while I, in my ignorance, had believed that I was Daniel's only mother, that the woman who'd given birth to him was truly anonymous and unknowable as the adoption agency had told us she wanted to be. I took screenshots methodically, my journalist training from my early career kicking in even through the shock and betrayal, capturing the most important emails, the ones that told the story most clearly, saving them to a folder I created on the desktop labeled simply receipts. A word that Daniel had taught me was what his generation called evidence of wrongdoing, and once I'd documented everything I needed to, I carefully closed the email application and the laptop, returning everything to exactly how I'd found it, my movements slow and deliberate because I needed time to think, to process, to figure out what I was going to do with this information that was too enormous to contain, too devastating to ignore. The house around me felt different now, foreign somehow, as if the walls and floors and ceilings that I'd lived within for 25 years had shifted when I wasn't looking, revealing themselves to be a stage set rather than a real home, and I walked through the rooms like a ghost, touching familiar objects. The pottery vase Daniel had made in high school that sat on the mantel, the wedding photo of Robert and me in its silver frame on the bookshelf, the comfortable couch where we'd spent countless evenings watching television and reading and simply existing together in companionable silence, and wondering if any of it was real, if any of it meant what I'd thought it meant. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I pulled it out with hands that still trembled, seeing Robert's name on the screen, a text message that read simply, "Did you find the documents? Harold is asking about them." And I stared at those words for a long moment, at the casual domesticity of them, at the way they assumed I was still the person I'd been this morning, the wife who would handle small tasks and fulfill small requests and maintain the smooth operation of our household, and I felt something hot and hard forming in my chest, something that might have been rage or might have been grief or might have been some awful combination of the two. I walked back to Robert's office, to his desk where his laptop sat closed and innocent-looking, and I picked up the framed photograph of the three of us at Daniel's graduation, studying our faces, Robert's arm around my shoulders, my hand resting on Daniel's back, all of us smiling at the camera with expressions of pride and joy and love, and I wondered how I could have looked at this photo hundreds of times over the years and never seen what was now so obvious, the way Daniel's eyes were shaped. Exactly like Robert's, the way their smiles curved in the same way. The genetic echoes that I'd somehow missed or dismissed or simply never thought to look for because I'd had no reason to question the story I'd been told. The photograph slipped from my fingers and I heard rather than saw it hit the hardwood floor, the glass in the frame cracking with a sound like ice breaking, a sharp definitive snap that seemed to echo through the quiet house, and I looked down at the fractured image, at the way the crack ran right through the center of our little family group, bisecting us into before and after, into the life I'd thought I was living and the truth I'd just discovered. From somewhere in my purse my phone buzzed again, probably Robert calling now instead of texting, wondering why I hadn't responded, and I knew I would have to answer eventually, would have to say something, but I couldn't bring myself to move toward it, Couldn't bring myself to speak to him before I'd figured out what I was going to say, how I was going to confront him about this betrayal that stretched across decades and touched every single aspect of our lives together. The rain continued its steady percussion against the windows, and the broken glass glittered on the floor at my feet, and I stood there in my husband's office surrounded by the evidence of his carefully organized life, his neatly filed secrets, and I thought about how you can live with someone for 38 years and share a bed and raise a child and plan for retirement and still, it turns out, not really know them at all, not really understand what they're capable of hiding, what enormous truths they can keep locked away behind passwords and private email addresses and carefully maintained lies. The phone stopped buzzing, and in the silence that followed, I heard my own voice, barely above a whisper, asking the empty room a question that I already knew would change everything. What else don't I know? 6 months had passed since the afternoon I'd stood in Robert's office with broken glass at my feet and the wreckage of my understanding scattered around me like shrapnel, and now I found myself sitting in that same chair, at that same desk, but everything about the moment was different in ways both subtle and profound, transformed not by the changing of the physical space, though Robert had replaced the carpet and repainted the walls a softer shade of gray at my request, but by the complete reconstruction of what this room meant, what this house meant, what our life together meant in the context of truth rather than carefully maintained illusion. The rain was falling again because this was Seattle and it was April now, and the rain came as reliably as breathing, but this time I welcomed the sound of it, the steady drum against the windows that provided a kind of white noise backdrop to my thoughts as I sat with Robert's laptop open in front of me, not snooping this time but writing, documenting, creating something that would serve as a record for the future, for the grandchildren who were coming. Emma was 7 months pregnant now, her belly round and full of promise, and who would need to understand the complicated, messy, beautiful truth of how their family came to be. Robert appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of tea, Earl Grey for me and green for him, the steam rising from the ceramic mugs in delicate wisps that caught the light from the desk lamp, and he set mine down carefully on the coaster to my right, not speaking, not interrupting, just making his presence known and then retreating to the armchair in the corner where he'd taken to sitting while I worked on this project, reading his book or scrolling through his own laptop or sometimes just watching me with an expression that I'd learned to recognize as a mixture of gratitude and shame and love and fear that I might still, even now, decide that the breach was too great to heal. We were not where we had been, Robert and I, that innocent, unquestioning partnership that had characterized the first 38 years of our marriage was gone forever, shattered as completely as the glass in that photograph frame had shattered, but we were finding our way towards something else, something that felt more solid precisely because it was built on truth rather than assumption, on conscious choice rather than comfortable habit. The therapy sessions had been brutal at first, sitting in Dr. Morrison's office with its abstract art and its box of tissues strategically placed on the table between the 2 chairs where Robert and I sat, sometimes holding hands and sometimes sitting as far apart as the furniture would allow, depending on what had been said in the previous minute. And there had been sessions where I'd cried so hard I'd thought I might actually break apart, where the rage I felt at his deception had poured out of me in words that were designed to wound because I wanted him to feel even a fraction of the pain I was experiencing. Robert had taken it all, had sat there and absorbed my anger and my grief and my sense of betrayal without defending himself, without making excuses, and slowly, over weeks and then months, he told me everything. Not just about Sarah and Daniel and the adoption, but about his whole life before me, about growing up as the son of Chinese immigrants in a working-class neighborhood where he'd always felt caught between 2 worlds, about meeting Sarah Lockwood at a college party and falling in love with her despite knowing that her wealthy old-money family would never accept him, about the pregnancy that had terrified them both and the way her family had swooped in with their money and their lawyers and their threats to destroy him if he didn't disappear. He told me about the night of the accident, about how Sarah's brother James had been driving her to the hospital when she'd gone into labor early, about how James had been drinking at some political fundraiser and had crashed the car into a guardrail on a rain-slicked road not unlike the one visible through the window now, and about how James had fled the scene, leaving his pregnant sister trapped in the wreckage, calling their family's lawyer before he called for an ambulance, and about how the Lockwood family had used their considerable influence to make the whole incident disappear from official records, paying off witnesses and police officers and hospital staff to ensure that their golden boy's political future remained untarnished. Robert had explained, his voice breaking with the weight of a secret he'd carried for 35 years, How Sarah's family had given him a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. Take the baby and never contact Sarah again, or face fabricated evidence that would make him look like the drunk driver, that would send him to prison and ensure he never saw his child at all, and how he'd agreed to their terms but had secretly arranged through a sympathetic lawyer to be listed as one of the approved adoptive parents, had essentially adopted his own biological son while pretending to everyone, including me, that it was a standard private adoption. The part that had hurt the most, that still hurt when I let myself dwell on it, was not the history itself. I could understand, even if I couldn't quite forgive, the impossible position Robert had been in as a young man facing down a powerful family determined to protect their own interests, but rather the 38 years of continued deception, the daily choice he'd made to maintain the lie, to let me believe I knew the full story when I only knew a carefully edited version designed to protect me from truths he'd decided I couldn't handle. He'd continued his secret correspondence with Sarah, sending her photos of Daniel on his birthdays and after his graduations and when he'd gotten married to Emma, maintaining a connection to his first love and to his son's biological mother, while I, in my ignorance, had believed that the three of us, Robert, Daniel and I, were a complete family unit with no hidden connections, no secret relationships running parallel to our visible life. And the thought of all those years of partial truth, of edited reality, still had the power to make my chest feel tight, and my eyes burn with tears that I'd learned to let fall rather than holding them back. But Daniel, our son, my son, regardless of biology or the circumstances of his birth, had been the one who'd ultimately helped me understand that there was a path forward through this devastation, that truth, however painful, was ultimately less destructive than the continued maintenance of lies. And I thought now about the afternoon 3 months ago when he'd come to the house alone, without Emma, and had sat with me in the living room and told me, with tears streaming down his face, that learning about his biological origins had been traumatic and world-shaking, but that the one constant, the one thing that had never wavered or felt uncertain, was his knowledge that I was his mother in every way that mattered, that the woman who'd raised him and loved him and shaped him into the person he'd become was not diminished or replaced by the existence of Sarah, who had loved him enough to give him life, and then give him up so he could have the life she couldn't provide. Daniel had taken my hand that afternoon, his fingers warm and solid around mine, and he'd said something that I'd written down later in my journal because I knew I'd want to remember the exact words. Mom, Dad lied to you about where I came from, and that's something he has to live with and work to make right, but he didn't lie about the most important thing, which is that you were always meant to be my mother, that our family was always meant to be exactly what it is, and nothing I've learned about my birth or Sarah or any of it changes the fact that when I think of home, I think of you. Those words had broken something open in me, some knot of fear that I'd been carrying since the day I'd opened Robert's laptop, the terror that discovering Daniel's biological origins would somehow invalidate my relationship with him, would reveal that my motherhood had been conditional or temporary or based on incomplete information, and in releasing that fear I'd found that I could begin, slowly and painfully, to forgive Robert, not because what he'd done was forgivable but because the alternative, a life of bitterness and resentment, a marriage that existed only as an empty shell, was simply too exhausting to maintain. Sarah had died in February, on a gray Tuesday morning when the rain had been falling so hard it seemed like the sky was mourning with us, and I'd been there in the hospice room along with Robert and Daniel and Emma, the four of us gathered around her bed as she'd slipped away with a peaceful expression that suggested she'd accomplished what she'd needed to accomplish, had achieved the closure she'd been seeking when she'd sent that email that had started this entire cascade of revelations. In the weeks before her death, I'd spent time with her, tentatively at first and then with increasing ease, and we'd talked about Daniel, about the baby she'd given birth to and the man he'd become, and she'd thanked me over and over for giving him the life she couldn't, for loving him the way she'd wanted to love him but had been prevented from doing by circumstances and family pressure, and the cruel calculus of class and privilege that had determined that her love wasn't enough, that she wasn't enough simply because she'd been 19 and scared, and without the resources to fight back against her family's demands. I'd learned in those conversations with Sarah as she lay dying in that sterile hospice room with its beeping machines and its smell of antiseptic and its window that looked out onto a parking lot rather than anything beautiful, that there was room in my heart for multiple truths, that I could acknowledge her as Daniel's biological mother without diminishing my own role in his life, that love was not a finite resource that had to be rationed and protected but rather something that expanded to fill whatever space you gave it, and that the most radical thing I could do in the face of Robert's betrayal was not to harden my heart against everyone but rather to open it wider, to include Sarah in the story of our family rather than treating her as a threat to be eliminated or ignored. She'd given me a gift in those final weeks, though I don't think she realized it. She'd shown me that I could survive having my understanding of my life completely shattered and still find beauty in the pieces, still construct something meaningful from the fragments. The question of James Lockwood, Sarah's brother and the senator whose career had been built on a foundation of lies and cover-ups and his family's money, had been more complicated to navigate, and Daniel had spent weeks in therapy working through his feelings about the man who'd nearly killed him before he was even born and then had spent 35 years pretending the accident had never happened, living a public life of political service while privately knowing that he'd fled the scene of a crash that could have killed his sister and his unborn nephew. In the end, Daniel had decided not to go public with the story, not to destroy James Lockwood's career through exposure, but rather to write him a letter. I'd helped him draft it, my old editing skills coming in handy, that laid out everything we knew and made it clear that the truth was no longer safely buried, that there were multiple people now who knew what had really happened, and that if James wanted to continue his political career with any integrity, he needed to find a way to make amends, whether through policy work that helped survivors of drunk driving accidents or through private acknowledgement of his role in the cover-up or through some other mechanism that Daniel would leave to his conscience. The letter had gone unanswered for 2 months, and then unexpectedly James Lockwood had quietly withdrawn his name from consideration for the Supreme Court nomination, citing personal reasons and a desire to spend more time with his family, and while we couldn't know for certain that our letter had influenced his decision, Daniel had felt that justice in its own imperfect way had been served, that the man who'd run away from responsibility all those years ago had finally faced at least some consequence for his actions, even if the full truth never became public knowledge. There was something satisfying about that, about knowing that we held the power to destroy James Lockwood's career but choosing instead to let him destroy it himself through his own cowardice and inability to face what he'd done. And I thought now about the different kinds of power that existed in the world, not just the obvious power of wealth and political connections that the Lockwood family had wielded so effectively, but also the quieter power of truth, of moral clarity, of choosing when to speak and when to let silence do the work. Robert and I had moved slowly toward reconciliation, if that's even the right word for what we were doing. It felt less like going back to something we'd had before and more like building something entirely new from materials that included both the good memories of our decades together and the painful knowledge of his deception. And there were still nights when I lay awake in what had been our shared bed but was now just my bed, since I'd moved into the guest room and hadn't yet felt ready to return to the master bedroom, and I wondered if I'd made the right choice in staying, in working to repair rather than simply walking away and starting over. But then I'd think about the look on Robert's face when Daniel had told him, after weeks of painful silence between them, that he was willing to rebuild their relationship, that he understood his father had been young and scared and trapped by circumstances but that earning back trust would be a years-long process that would require consistent honesty and vulnerability, and I'd remember that love, real love, wasn't about never being hurt but about deciding that the person who hurt you was worth the hard work of healing.